Hello and welcome back to Soteriology 101. Today you can see we have a guest with us today, a name you probably recognize, Justin Brierley. Welcome to the program.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Leighton. Thanks for having me on.
Well, many of you who watch our program, I know, would be familiar with Justin's program as well. Justin has been working in radio and broadcasting for about 2 decades now. He hosts the amazing, unbelievable radio show and podcast on Premier Christian Radio, as well as the Ask the NT Wright Anything podcast, one of my favorites. And he is a theology and apologetics editor for Premier Christian Radio. And from 2014 to 2018, he was the editor of Premier Christianity magazine, for which he also continues to contribute articles. Justin's first book, Unbelievable, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian, was published back in 2017. And links will be provided there in the show notes for Justin's broadcast and his other resources. But I would love to hear what new things are going on with you, Justin. How are you doing? What's coming up?
Yeah. Oh, it's a really busy time. Thank you, Leighton, because we're in the midst of really launching Unbelievable on kind of a new footing, really. Premier Unbelievable is the name of our kind of new ministry or department, which covers much more than just the Unbelievable show, which has been going for about 15, 16 years now. But we, as you've already mentioned, we've been adding other resources to our stable, the Ask NT Wright Anything podcast, for instance. We also do a regular podcast with Alistair McGrath on C.S. Lewis. We've been launching other shows and video resources. We've started to produce online training courses, and we're doing regular webinars and live stream events. There's an awful lot going on, and we're kind of launching it all, in under one roof, as it were, at our forthcoming Unbelievable conference. So that's happening on Saturday, the 14th of May. But you can attend from anywhere in the world. We're live from the British Library in London. That's where we'll be hosting it from. Wow. And we'll have an in-person audience there. It's very exciting. First time we've been able to do really an in-person conference in a few years now. But it's all online as well, so you can attend from anywhere in the world. In fact, we're trying to do it at a time that will suit folk in the US, especially in Canada. So it's 2 p.m. in the UK, but 9 a.m. Eastern is when it would begin in the US. So it's going to be a good day. We've got a lineup of about 10 contributors. There's going to be lots of panel Q&A throughout the day. The theme is God Unmuted. It's how do we speak with grace and truth into a confused and divided world. We live in times of the culture wars, cancel culture, big debates over ideologies, identity, race, and everything else. And I've just, this has dominated our timelines, our social media, a lot of the conversations we're having. And I thought this is the time to have a frank and honest conversation about that. We've got, an interesting, diverse panel of Christians who are going to be tackling it from different perspectives. And it's just going to be an opportunity, I think, to listen, learn, and to go away hopefully more confident in actually sharing our faith and speaking into these big issues. So that's happening Saturday, the 14th of May. And we would love for anyone who wants to come along to be part of that online, because it's actually, you can attend for free if you wanted. There's a pay what you want option with the online side. But it's all of the info, tickets, and everything is available at our website for that, which is unbelievable.live. So that's the big project for me at the moment. That's just a few weeks away now.
That's amazing. I'll put some link in the show notes for our listeners to be able to go back and find that as well, because I'd love for our listeners to participate. And I just want to say, Justin, I've been a fan for years, listening to your broadcast, and really admiring the way in which you interview people. I'm not as polished as you are in that field, because I have way too many opinions to be a good interviewer. You have always been very good at keeping your opinions to yourself. And I was really curious, is that difficult? Have you kind of had to learn to do that over the years, bite your tongue when you want to say something that you believe?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. No, I mean, and there are times I'll happily admit when I do step in and kind of offer my own opinions, probably more than I should. But I have kind of built the show, the Unbelievable show, around the idea of kind of being a neutral meeting place where different perspectives, right, whether they be different parts of the Christian church or atheists and Christians, people of other faiths meeting Christians, where those two guests are the ones who offer their opinions and perspectives, and I try to, in a sense, just facilitate that. And that does sometimes, mean biting my tongue when I want to kind of actually leap in or or even sometimes when I feel like, I could be doing a better job than this particular person. So you've got to just, you just have to accept that you've invited two people on, and you've got to give them their space to do it their way, So yeah, it's like that.
I've wondered about that. I've wondered when people aren't doing such a great job representing, especially the Christian faith, whether you're able to contain yourself, and you always do a very professional job in that front. And plus, I think the accent for us Texans, we're enthralled by the accent from you. Always sound so much more polished.
I know
and
you
smart.
guys. You'll have a good English accent, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
I don't know what it is. I often hear this, but I for some reason, there's obviously this cultural association that an English accent somehow makes you feel 20% more intelligent or something, but it's absolutely not true. But
whereas
I'm
the Texan,
go ahead.
The Texas accent is just the opposite. It's 20% dumber. So that I've got that working for me.
Well, all I can say is if that kind of helps to give the illusion, then I'm all for it. But it's not true in reality, that's for sure.
Well, oftentimes as the interviewer, you're introducing the scholars and the authors, and so the role is going to be reversed a little bit for you today, because I want to put you on the hot seat and ask your opinions about things, and kind of get your perspective. And before kind of diving into the topic of this particular broadcast, which happens to be soteriology, I'd love for our listeners to know a little bit more about you. Just your upbringing, how you became a Christian, how you got into broadcasting and apologetics and those kinds of things. Yeah,
well, I was fortunate to be raised in a Christian home. Both my parents were kind of adult converts, really, to Christianity, although, funnily enough, they'd both come from Christian families. Both of their parents, fathers were priests in the Church of England, but I don't think they'd really kind of taken it on board themselves by the time they went to university. But they had quite sort of radical conversions to Christianity at university, and I was raised, in that sense, in a very sort of committed Christian environment growing up. Went to church, had a peer group of other young Christians around me, which isn't necessarily always common in the UK, where there are far fewer Christians, frankly, than in the US, where you could be part of a community almost where you maybe only really almost know Christians. It's not that way in the UK. So you do stand out more if you profess a Christian faith, I think, especially as a young person in the UK. It really became my own, I'd say, at around the age of 15, when I went on a youth retreat, and having up to that point really just attended church and done it because my parents did it. It really became real for me. I'd say that God met me in a very special way, where things just came alive. The penny dropped. I began to see the world in a new way. I'd say it was an experience, at one level, simply of the Holy Spirit kind of awakening me to the good news of Jesus and to the life of Jesus, which obviously I've gone on a huge learning journey since then, but that was very much the formative moment when everything sort of did fall into place in a new way. That moment sort of birthed the fire, the passion in a way for me, but it had to be caught up by the intellectual side of me as well, I think, because as I went through my late teens and into university, I soon started meeting a lot of the objections that there are out there to Christianity. I went to Oxford University, and there's no lack of skeptics and people who are ready to take serious pops at your faith and to ask all kinds of difficult questions. Having said that, there's also a thriving Christian union and has been for hundreds of years at Oxford University, and so that was a great way in which to explore both the objections and the evidences for Christianity. And I think that was that, alongside sort of my own personal interest in, I suppose, drama and presentation, led me down the route eventually, as once I'd left university, to wanting to do something in the arts, in the media, that sort of brought together the evidence for Christianity and a popular format for delivering it in. That eventually became Unbelievable, the radio show, which became a podcast and now obviously exists on video, and we do conferences and books and lots of other resources around it. So that was sort of how the journey all began. I think it began sort of just because I was interested in these issues, and I wanted to ultimately engage other people in the issues, hopefully in, using whatever media and best resources I could. So that's the short story, really.
It's always good to hear other Christians' journey, and especially when you can relate so well to them. You and I seem to have a lot in common. We both are involved in broadcasting. Not me at the level that you are, obviously. We both have worked with youth previously. Both of us are married with 4 children, 3 boys and 1 girl. And so it's just, both of us had Christian parents, so we're raised in a Christian home. Really firmed up our faith in our teenage years, and so there's a lot of common ground between us, and so it's good to hear a brother's testimony that very much relates to mine.
And we're both still in our early 20s as well, which is great. Yeah. So it's great all around.
You might be able to pass for that, but the gray gives me away.
The gray's coming through here as well. Don't you worry about it. It's all. I look at least
15 to 20 years your senior, and I know that's not the case, but I've always been that way. My wife is actually 2 years older than me, and we had a picture with her on Facebook at her graduation from her master's, with her master's degree, which she got later in life because she kind of took a mom break. And a lot of people were commenting underneath there, "Oh, your daughter is so beautiful," and so that's not my daughter. That is my wife. Thank you. And she is older than I am.
When your wife gets mistaken for your daughter. Oh my goodness. Anyway,
she loved it. Of course, she was reposting that a lot, so that's fun. Anyway, obviously this program, as you know, was started for the purpose of kind of tackling this controversial issue among Christians with regard to Calvinism, predestination, Arminianism, provisionism, as we've coined it. You've had me on your broadcast with our friend Chris Date to talk about these differences of opinion. One of the reasons I started this is because I saw just a huge void and vacuum online, at least with regard to defending in a robust way the other side of the theological aisle. And I was delighted when I kind of was researching you in particular, just because I kind of wanted to know where you stood when I was coming onto your program, because I didn't know, a whole lot about your particular view. And I came across an article that you wrote back in 2018, why both atheists and Christians should affirm free will. And so maybe tell our audience a little bit about your own view on this particular hot button topic. Now that you have the freedom to do so, because you don't have to be unbiased as the host this time, just come right out and give it to us how you kind of came to your conclusions on this topic.
Well, it's funny, when I published that article, it was kind of the first time I'd taken a public stand, if you like, on the issue, even though I had my own views on it obviously for some time. But in a way, because I've primarily up to this point been known as the host of a show where I bring different perspectives on, and I don't necessarily always play my own hand there. I think not many people would have necessarily known exactly where I stood on the issue of free will, determinism, Calvinism, and so on. But this was me sort of saying, okay, this is actually where I do stand on it. It actually was related, that article, to an episode of our Big Conversation series, and this is a special sort of set of videos from Unbelievable, where we bring some of the biggest thinkers in the world together to debate the biggest questions. In fact, we're just about to launch in a few weeks' time season 4, where we've got some really exciting guests lined up. The Big Conversation show is the place to keep updated on that. But this was in relation to one of our early shows from the Big Conversation, which featured Daniel Dennett and Keith Ward. Daniel Dennett, I'm sure many people are familiar with the name, atheist philosopher, who is he's a determinist, though he's what they call compatibilist, and we'll come to that. But part of their discussion, Keith Ward being a Christian philosopher who does believe in free will, was around this whole issue of, are we just determined by the universe effectively to do, that what will happen and we really have no control over it? Or do we in fact have, some actual free will, the ability to really choose between options, alternatives, and everything else? So that was a fascinating discussion. And it kind of sparked my thinking on this to the degree that, not many people realize, but there's an equivalent debate, isn't there, on that in the Christian world as there is kind of in the atheist, materialist, philosophical world. And of course, for Christians, it's the question of whether God ultimately, rather than the universe, predetermines everything. And for me, I think while I've heard a lot of, good arguments for Calvinism, let's say logically consistent arguments, it's just never felt right to me at an intuitive level that that's the way God would arrange things. And to that extent, although I've often seen Calvinists as sort of having a very sort of, their theology kind of works within its system, if you like, I just don't like the consequence of that system, which for me feels not worthy at some level of a God who created us with all our incredible complexity and the moral agency we have and everything else, for it all to ultimately boil down to, you could only have ever done what you did, you really had no choice in the matter, just doesn't feel right to me. It doesn't and so for me, that's kind of been the starting place, I suppose, at an intuitive level of feeling like there must be freedom, there must be free will, there must be a degree to which we can choose God, we can choose to love God or to reject God, we can choose to love each other or to hate each other. It doesn't seem to go well with just the idea of what it is to be human, if actually either on an atheistic level or a Christian level it boils down to, you had no choice, it was always going to be this way. All that's really going on is either a predetermined set of chemical reactions that are causing you to do the things you do, or a predetermined set of decisions on God's part that have basically ordained what you will and won't do. And then it's really after that I've then gone and looked at the scriptures and said, okay, well what do I do with these texts that the Calvinists say clearly show that there is a God who has predetermined every moment and molecule in the universe? And I just think that it's a rather wooden reading of some of the key passages there, or a very specific type of reading that brings you to that conclusion. And there are, for me, too many counter examples in scripture that just seem to clearly negate that idea as well, for it to be in any way a cut and dried kind of, this is what the Bible teaches. So for me, it started with that kind of sense that I don't want that to be the way things are, and then looking into scripture, the sense that, and I don't think that's actually what the Bible says about the way things are either. That's kind of where I began with it.
Yeah. Now, the argument from intuition, Braxton Hunter, who I know you've had on the program as well, Dr. Hunter from Trinity Seminary, he talks about this as well. The argument from intuition is actually not just because it doesn't feel right, because I think anybody could object to the emotional appeal argument, say just because it's not emotionally sitting right with you doesn't necessarily make it false. A lot of people emotionally don't like the concept of hell. Or punishment, or a lot of things that God may allow or do in this world. We may not like it emotionally, so that's not always a good reason to accept it, which is, of course, why you went on to say, I went to the scriptures to try to discern these things as well. But I think there is some strength in the argument from intuition, because God did create us. He created our feelings. He created our intuition. And as C.S. Lewis argues, if our black is his white is our black, then we can say we worship we know not what. There is no basis on which we can form opinions about what's good or bad if there's no sense of a conscience that God has given us to know the difference between right and wrong. And so I think that appeal to intuition that you mentioned is actually a strong point, because even Calvinists like R.C. Sproul and others have admitted in their writings that they strongly intuit or believe that we have the freedom of the will, and he even says he puts it in a derogatory way of saying we're all born semi-Pelagians, and that's his way of saying intuitively we're all born with this concept and idea that we do make meaningful choices that do make a difference, and that God ultimately is not determining which choices we'll make, but that we'll be free to make choices, as A.W. Tozer puts it. And so I found your article real interesting. I wanted to present one little section of it, if you don't mind. It says, the freedom to choose God here, it says, inevitably mysteries still remain, you write. The age-old theological conundrum of reconciling the God who knows every future event with genuine human freedom is one of them. Healthy dialogue and respect is important, which, by the way, I've always admired about you. You've always been very respectful to those who disagree with you over this topic, and I know you're very close friends. In fact, the forward of your book and Timothy Keller and McGrath, I believe, both would maybe disagree with you over this particular subject, or at least portions of your views on this particular subject. So the fact that you're able to work across the aisle, so to speak, with Christians who disagree with you on this point speaks volumes of your own Christian faith, which I think needs to be a better example for us online, because you see a lot of really bad behavior from supposedly fellow Christians treating other Christians not so kindly. And you go on to write, you say, I don't intend to smash any statues over the heads of many Calvinist theologians, which is you're recollecting a
story,
a funny story.
I'll tell you that story afterwards. Yeah, I will. But
yes, yeah, please do. But there are many possible options beyond Calvinism. Arminianism, Molinism, open theism, all have their supporters. Most recently, John Lennox has offered a very helpful synthesis of the divine sovereignty and human freedom in his accessible book, Determined to Believe. By the way, we did a review of that book as well, and I very much agree with John Lennox, though he may not claim to be a provisionist. He very much aligns with the provisionist doctrines, as I do, at least from what I read in his book. In the end, we will always have imperfect knowledge of God who exists beyond our temporal limitations. Paul recognized it. For now, we only see through a glass darkly, 1 Corinthians 13:12. But Paul also declared, it is for freedom that Christ set us free. Having genuine free will really matters. It's one of the reasons why I'm neither an atheist nor a Calvinist. I'd much rather be someone who imperfectly but freely chooses to follow Christ. Do you want to comment any more on that? Because I think that really summarizes your position pretty well.
It does to some extent, though having laid out other possible alternatives, I haven't sort of specifically nailed my colours to any of those masts. Now, and in a way, I've always shied away from coming down almost on a very specific position. I know what I'm not. I know I'm not a Calvinist. Yeah. I'm pretty sure I'm not an open theist, actually. Where, I mean, am I a Molinist? Am I an Arminian? Am I something else? So often I find it actually, the actual sort of, the problem is that as soon as you declare one of those as a label, you immediately see sort of that it's not so easy. You know, there are always going to be question marks over some aspects of it.
Right.
And in the end, although this is very unsatisfactory for a lot of people, I've kind of always just held the view that actually I am never going to be equipped intellectually as a mere mortal to fully understand or explain the way in which God's divine will operates with human freedom. I just know that it does. I just know that somehow God is big enough, wise enough to be able to bring about his divine purposes while engaging with genuine human freedom. Now, if I put a label on that, Arminian or whatever, I'm you know, maybe I would be able to sign up to a lot of what a typical Arminian kind of framework looks like. But I'm certainly not an expert on this, so I don't claim to have in any way looked in it as deeply as you do, Leighton. And to that extent, I'm more kind of almost happy to affirm what I don't believe than to say, and this is the way in fact it is, because right. I know I will quickly, if you put me in a debate with James White, I'm sure he'd make mincemeat of me. So you know, that's the reality of the situation.
Well, you mentioned compatibilism earlier, and just now you talked about how you believe it's absolutely essential for men to have genuine free will, and a compatibilist like James White or others might come back and say, well, we do believe in genuine free will, Justin. It's called compatibilism. And that free will is you're free as long as you're doing what you want to do. And you genuinely want to do what you want to do. And that is the measure of what makes men free. How would you respond to that when people use compatibilism as kind of their way in which they try to maintain a genuine sense of human freedom and responsibility while also holding to theistic determinism?
Yeah, I understand why people would go down the compatibilist route, and of the kind of deterministic options out there, it's the one that's I suppose, the most helpful in terms of getting you somewhere nearer something that feels a bit more like freedom. But for me, as I think, I quote Kant in the article, who described it as a wretched subterfuge, because ultimately I can't but logically go the next step and say, yes, but that desire that you are feeling has still been preordained. It isn't genuinely free. It may feel free to you, and I think that's where a compatibilist like Dennett would say, well, for all intents and purposes, as long as you feel like you're not being compelled, as long as you feel like you're free, then you are basically free. But the problem is, I'm not happy with just an illusion of freedom. I want genuine freedom. It's a bit like, being told you're in the Matrix, and as long as you feel like you're experiencing real life and everything else, but actually deep down it's all an illusion by some clever computer, I mean, then you're not actually experiencing these things and these feelings. You're being given the impression of it, but it's not the real thing. So for me, determinism, the compatibilism just doesn't kind of, it just sort of puts the problem off a little bit, but it's still there waiting in the wings. And I just hasn't ever struck me as a satisfactory solution to that intuition, if you like, that freedom's only free if it's really free,
Yeah, well said. I can hear the Calvinistic interlocutor in my mind, and so I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate and give the Calvinists some hearing and say,
sure.
Well, it seems to me that you're being more humanistic because you're trying to defend human freedom. You even said there in your answer, I want freedom. I want this concept of free will because intuitively I believe it's true. And some may call that humanistic. They may call that even a form of idolism, idol worship, that you're worshiping at the idol of, as I've been accused of believing, worshiping at the idol of human free will. How would you respond to a Calvinist that said something like that in response to you?
Well, only in the same sense that you could accuse me of worshipping at the idol of love, or of compassion, or these things as I see them are good in and of themselves, and to say that sort of desire for that thing to be true, to really be true, is somehow I'm making an idol of it. Well, only in a set, I don't see how that argument runs, because for me the idea of human freedom is so integral to what it is to be human and the nature of God. I find it very hard to see how simply saying this feels so important that you can't just let it go can be accused of sort of putting my human wants and needs or preferences above it. It would be a bit like saying, how can you ask God to be a loving God, or how can you say that love, that love should be the primary motivation in your life? That's just putting love ahead of God. Well, no, because I don't distinguish, God and love, the attribute of love, from God, and I wouldn't do the same with freedom either. I'd say for me it's so bound up with the nature of God that I'm not worshipping something else. I just want to recognize the true God that is there. How would you answer it though, Leighton? Because you probably do a much better job than me of that.
I loved your answers. Matter of fact, your answer on compatibilism is exactly the answer that I would give, and what you just said there was very well put. Sometimes I might jokingly, when accused of worshiping at the idol of free will, I would ask, do you believe I'm doing that freely? Just to kind of make them realize that the inevitable consequence of the position.
That's kind of the weird logic of it is that if I disagree with Calvinism, it's only because God made it that way. I'm only doing what God's already decreed would happen. Yeah. So I've always been a bit confused by people who then argue so hard against me. Now, of course, it may be part of God's divine providence that this Calvinist will come and persuade me in the other direction. Who knows? But the point being that this is the other thing, and I talk about it a little bit in the article, is it's this bizarre consequence that nothing is really ultimately right or wrong, or at least we're not responsible for the right or wrongness of things, because we were bound to do them. So even if I've if I'm completely wrong about Calvinism, and in fact Calvinism is true, I couldn't have done anything else than what I, than what I do believe about.
Well, it's like, William Lane Craig talks about a vertigo kind of sets in when you really begin to unpack this concept of theistic determinism, because you're either right in defending human free will, or God is determined for you to be wrong. And if that's the case, you really can't do much about it except hope that God determines you to start believing in determinism, which I know some Calvinists get very frustrated by that argument, because they think it's just a joke, or that we're just, on repeat because we say it over and over again. But I think that's an argument that is a very sound theological argument that Dr. Tim Stratton has unpacked very well, I think, in his work as well. The free thinking argument is that if we truly are held responsible, then there must be underlying that an ability to respond freely to the appeal of the gospel, to the call of Scripture to be reconciled. And I think intuitively, as you've already mentioned, is kind of underlying that. It's interesting.
I was going to say,
sorry.
I was just going to mention this story that we referenced in the thing, because it's
I was forgot about that. Yes, please do. That'd be great.
Funny example of this, but I started that article with a story that a friend of mine told me, who, when he was in Bible college as a student, he was having an intense argument with another Bible college student who was a Calvinist, and this person did not believe in Calvinism, really, and they went at it day after day. One day he got so annoyed while he was in the dorm room of this other student who was the Calvinist, that he took a kind of plaster of Paris bust of John Calvin that this person had on their shelf, and he smashed it over the head of this friend. Now, I don't think their relationship was irreparably damaged from this. I think they made up and everything else, and it was obviously the wrong thing for this chap to do. But it did make me laugh, because I said to him, surely you could have just given the excuse that, well, I was determined to do it. It's not my fault. I was always bound to smash that bust of Calvin over your head. And that's the problem, is that if a Calvinist, for me, a Calvinist or an atheist determinist, if they say you should have done that, the obvious answer is, what do you mean? I didn't have any choice in the matter, did I? On your philosophy. So it does produce all kinds of weird kind of contradictory kind of senses. This idea that determinism is really true.
Well, and I've noticed with Calvinists, my friends who claim to be Calvinistic, there's a lot of seemingly, at least to me, inconsistencies in how they apply their Calvinism. Many of them distance themselves from the concept of determinism, sometimes ignoring the fact that compatibilists are determinists. That's what the whole word compatible is about. Determinism is compatible with free will, so you have to affirm determinism in order to be a compatibilist. And some seem to think that compatibilism is somehow not determinism, and so maybe they're just philosophically confused about that particular label. But I'm just wondering, in your experience, have you found that there are those there in the UK and other areas, and I know you talk to people all over the world, that claim to be Calvinistic soteriologically, but philosophically they still maintain this concept of libertarian freedom, and really try to distance themselves from some of the micromanaging types of language that you might hear from the higher theistic determinist Calvinists?
Yeah, I think that is true to say that a lot of the people I engage with, and frankly in the US as well, while they might theoretically, sign up to a kind of Calvinist perspective, the way they actually talk about it in the public domain, especially if they're apologists, essentially if that's the thing they do, they will frequently appeal to human freedom and human, as a defense against, for instance, the problem of evil, the free will defense and so on. I've heard people who are in principle Calvinists using that kind of a defense. And I do think there is a logical contradiction there, because ultimately I don't think you can run the free will defense for evil if you actually believe God has actually predetermined everything that will happen. So I think there are people maybe who hold their Calvinist views perhaps more lightly, in the sense that they don't see that it necessarily implies a kind of very strict, thoroughgoing sort of kind of predeterminism, but I'm not sure what it would be if it wasn't that. Ultimately, it wouldn't really be Calvinism in the sense that I know it if it wasn't. I guess, yeah. So I think frankly, very often the people who are really pushing a very hard determinist Calvinist line tend to be people who are the most concerned doctrinally with a kind of a drift towards some kind of, what they would regard as, wrong theology. Whereas the ones that sort of come, say, from a Calvinist tradition, but don't seem to dwell on the implications of that for free will and so on, in my experience, they tend to be kind of willing to kind of fudge the issue a bit when it comes to actually when freedom is a helpful thing to actually use in an argument or to talk about at some level. And I count many of them friends, so I'm not here to sort of bash anyone who I see doing that. I just think it is a bit actually inconsistent with their actual views if they are a Calvinist.
Do you find yourself being accused very regularly when you're having conversations about this particular topic of not really understanding Calvinism? That's been a common refrain that I've heard, accusations that are brought against me, just even though I was a former Calvinist and wrote papers on the subject and have sermons that have been recorded back when I was a Calvinist that I've played before in evidence, still accused of having never been really a real Calvinist or understanding Calvinism. And I was just wondering if that was something that you had dealt with as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't get involved in these debates nearly as much as you do, Leighton, so I don't get accused very often of that because I'm not usually, this isn't the issue I tend to be writing or speaking on most of the time.
Right.
But for instance, just in that instance where that article got published, I certainly, had people like James White on my case saying we should do a debate, which I politely declined. But the point is that I suppose, yes, the fact is, I'm sure I haven't read everything Calvin wrote, and I haven't, and I am not probably up on every intricacy of the Calvinist perspective. Where I have been, encountered articles or people have sent me things to sort of try and persuade me in a different direction, I still haven't read anything that for me basically because it kind of solves the problem of what determinism is ultimately, what the implications of it are. And I know that obviously there are others who feel like you can have enough of a form of free will to so that it isn't a sort of moral problem, or simply grit their teeth and say this is the best reading of scripture and you're just going to have to live with the uncomfortable nature of what it means about God or human freedom or whatever. But again, I've never felt compelled to do that and to kind of go that distance. And I mean, like I say, I mean, in practice, when the rubber meets the road, the way that I engage people for Christ, and the way most of my Calvinist friends engage people for Christ is usually quite similar, actually.
Yes.
So the point at which the issue of whether God has actually predetermined someone's choice seems to be a kind of almost secondary issue in that. And it doesn't necessarily impact very much the actual way in which we will go about trying to, bring someone to Christ in the first place. So I'm not quite sure what the practical outworking of it is. I'm sure there are for some people, but I don't personally find that it makes a difference in most practical senses. Very often it feels more like just a debate that certain Christians are having amongst themselves.
I would definitely think that that's true among more the moderate type Calvinists that we were talking about, that philosophically pretty much agree with us with regard to libertarian freedom of the will, but say soteriologically they are somewhat 3-point or 4-point Calvinists or something like that. Usually you won't see much of a difference at all in the way they do apologetics or evangelism. But unfortunately, I'm seeing more and more of a trend in the higher Calvinistic kind of community, so to speak, where, as I played in one of my just more recent episodes, just some Calvinists doing apologetics in evangelism, talking to atheists, and how Calvinism gets intertwined in their apologetic methodology, because the atheist or the Mormon, whoever they're talking to, happens to know their views on that subject, and so they begin to press them and say things like, well, don't you believe that I have to be chosen and God has to irresistibly grace me to cause me to want to believe? And they have to say yes, because they're being pressed on this. And then all of a sudden, the atheist or the Mormon or whoever it is kind of abrogates his responsibility to repent, believe, and says, well, I'll just wait on God to do that for me, because right now I'm not desirous to come to God. I don't believe what you say is true, and therefore, if God really wants me to believe it, according to you, he'll cause me to, so I'm pretty much happy right where I am. And that's where I think things can get a little devastating, and I think, can cause a practical harm.
Yeah.
Just recently, a guy I debated who was a kind of a higher form of Calvinism just tweeted that we shouldn't tell unbelievers that God loves them, which is another just a practical, I think, error that some higher Calvinists can make, where they remove the well-meant offer or the sense of God's genuine love and desire for all people. I think those can be practical errors. Do you see that can also be a harm for the Christian faith, and doing what your broadcast is attempting to do, is to make Christianity believable, to make Christianity reasonable, so that people can know it and believe it? Could that harm your efforts?
Yeah, I absolutely believe it could, and in a case where it would cause someone to say you cannot tell anyone that God loves them just in case he doesn't actually love that particular person, for me that's something's gone seriously wrong at that point. You've kind of lost something that for me is so obvious from the pages of Scripture, from the life of Jesus. It just, you have to have gone really far down a particular doctrinal rabbit hole to come out the other end saying we shouldn't tell people that God love, we shouldn't tell everyone that God loves them. So that does bother me a lot, that people kind of, I think, because they've created this particular systematic theology, which may seem to answer some questions, it can throw up massive obstacles to people, because although, to be fair, there are some Calvinists out there, or people who have a Calvinist theology, who are great evangelists and bring many people to Christ.
Absolutely.
And I'm not, but I don't think they do it because of their Calvinism. I think it's something else about the way they put their message out. And I think I experience more people who kind of Calvinism ultimately, rather than being something that sort of makes faith really make sense and accessible. Maybe for some people it does. I'm not saying this is true of everyone, but I find more people for whom it's a kind of it's a theological knot to be untied, rather than something that's kind of makes sense of Christianity. That's the way I see it anyway. So I feel like it is more of a hindrance in that sense than a kind of an aid to our evangelism and to that sort of thing. And like you say, it will inevitably, as soon as you sort of basically give a skeptic a stick to beat you with, they potentially will beat you with it. And Calvinism inevitably has all kinds of potential objections associated with it that are almost immediately obvious once you cotton onto the idea. So for me, if you don't have to hand someone an objection or a stick to beat you with, then don't. And I just don't think you do need to, because I just don't think Calvinism is true. So yeah, I think it is a problem when you get to that level in evangelism and sharing your faith. It's going to be a hard conversation if you are a Calvinist,
Yeah, I love what you wrote here in your article, Why Freedom Matters. And this is where you're kind of comparing, not in a provocative or polemic way, kind of the problem that atheists have as well as the problem that theistic determinists would have as well. And so you write this: so atheists have a major problem. If our thoughts are the product of a predetermined non-rational process, then why should we trust the reasoning that brought us to believe in that very process? In doing so, the atheist has cut off the branch they were sitting on. The only way to guarantee that our reasoning is itself rational is if there is a transcendent mind beyond the physical stuff of nature. Getting rid of God turns out to create more problems than it solves. Meanwhile, Christian determinists are faced with the problem of how to rescue the concepts of love and justice from being rendered meaningless by God, who controls every thought and desire. And I want to pause right there, because what you were saying earlier, and when I asked you the question about bowing at the altar of the idol of free will, I notice here what you're saying is exactly true. Is that it's not just a defense of man's freedom of the will. It's really a defense of God's love and justice, because if God's judging people for something they have absolutely no control over, I think that seems to fly in the face of his justice, and it certainly undercuts the well-meant offer of the gospel and his appeal of love for all people. And so I think understanding that that's the motivation we have here. We want men to be held blameworthy for their rejection of God, instead of saying that they're rejecting a God who first rejected them. Instead, we're saying they're rejecting a God who loves and provides for them, which is much worse. The blameworthiness of man is much higher if free will is true. And the character of God, I think, is much more exalted when we understand that men are responsible for their choices. But you go on to write, Calvinists may have a logically consistent view of God, but is he worthy of our worship? That's such a great question. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's that thing I was mentioning earlier, that I understand the Calvinist impulse to kind of get this mapped out, and in a way, determinism sort of solves a number of problems. It sort of means, well, now I've got a way of understanding how God gets everything done. He just micromanages it. He kind of sets it all in place to start with. But the problem is, that leaves me with a very small God, in a way. It leaves me with just a bigger version of like what my computer does, basically. It's very good at algorithmically predicting things and making things happen or whatever. But a God worth worshipping for me is one that can truly honor our human freedom and truly get his will done. And for me, that's going to be bigger than than the Calvinist picture, inevitably. So for me, and even though I can't describe, as a Calvinist maybe can, how that happens, because a Calvinist has a fairly tidy kind of sort of internally consistent, at least, sort of version of what that happens. I would rather live with some of the mystery of how God gets his purposes done in light of human freedom than kind of restrict myself to this much smaller version, in my view, of God that has to just micromanage everything, because that's the only way to get everything done, basically. But free will can't be part of that, because it's logically inconsistent with it or whatever. So that's why I was kind of trying to say I believe God is bigger, more intelligent, more wise, more powerful than me, and therefore, if anyone can reconcile sovereignty, divine sovereignty, and human free will, then God can. Okay, I can't, but God can, and that's what I see in the pages of Scripture happening, and everywhere else. So, I mean, and in a way, though, the bit you quoted before that, where I talk about the problem as it exists for atheists, that's where I more often talk about these issues, if I'm honest.
Yes.
I don't very often have these kinds of conversations that I'm having with you, Leighton, about Calvinism. Actually, most of the time this comes up in the context of me hosting debates, or even having debates myself with determinists who are atheists, and that's where I've most probably pressed this issue, is the problem that I think you undercut the whole concept of reason if you believe that we live in a essentially deterministic universe, that every thought and belief you have is essentially the process, as I said, of a non-rational collocation of atoms, as Bertrand Russell put it. It seems then that you've basically surrendered the reasoning process to a non-rational thing. It's something that just is about physical things happening in brains, and at that point, I think you really run into a problem, because if ultimately me being a Christian and someone else being an atheist is actually the result of just the different ways that our brains fizz, the kind of the end result of a kind of determined process. We were always bound to believe this, and they were going to believe that way. How can an atheist then start to talk about well, give me more evidence and I'll believe, or, make a better rational argument, I'll believe. No, if you're committed as an atheist to determinism, that's not the reason you believe it. You believe it because of physical things that have happened in your brain, which were determined billions of years ago in the initial conditions of the universe. So it strikes me as a really problematic issue for atheists who affirm determinism, because the thing that they most prize, which is their reason and their rationality, gets completely undercut by the actual system they believe in. And this, I've debated this with one or two people, including a well-known atheist YouTuber called Rationality Rules. And when I pressed him on this, I said, I just find it highly ironic that you are a determinist and yet you say rationality rules, because no, rationality does not rule. Determinism rules if your worldview is true. And I didn't find a satisfactory response. I still haven't found, in my view, a satisfactory response to that problem, which is, again, kind of hard sometimes to get your head around, because it is a very sort of conceptually sort of interesting philosophical problem. But once you get it, and I think people like C.S. Lewis got it and expressed it quite well, for me, it is a massive problem for people who believe in determinism as atheists.
You mentioned just now C.S. Lewis, which would be obviously a very well-known apologist, theologian that held to free will theology like we would. You've also mentioned there in the article John Lennox and his book, Determined to Believe, which is, I think, a masterful book if you're looking to dive into these topics more in depth from an apologist vantage point, no less. A very, very intelligent apologist, no doubt, with Dr. Lennox. But any others? I know that you do a podcast with N.T. Wright, and I've played, I quote from him about 3 or 4 times in my own book on the subject, as well as play his clips quite regularly. Though he never claims a label on this particular topic, at least as far as I can tell. He seems to, at least in his exegetical commentaries on the passages in question, he seems to very much side with where I stand on many of these issues. And I was just wondering if that's a topic that's come up or a discussion that's been had very often with N.T. Wright.
Yeah, we've covered it a few times in our podcast. People do quite a lot of the questions we get in are asking very specific doctrinal questions. The thing with Tom is, as you'll know if you've listened to him, is he doesn't like to sort of be given a label, whether it be on the issue of hell. He won't sort of say, well, I'm an annihilationist, or I'm a this, or I'm a that. He tends to just want to sort of paint out, describe the way he sees it, but he's not going to say, therefore I fit into this particular label. Likewise with the issue of free will and determinism. I mean, I think from everything I've spoken to him, he's certainly not a Calvinist, though I think he, obviously there are aspects of Reformed theology generally that he would say yes to and find useful, but not the specifics of predestination and so on. And I think, from everything I've spoken to him and that he said to me, he affirms a genuine form of human freedom. I think he would just say, I think a bit like me, it's very hard for human minds to simply crack that puzzle and say this is how it works, because God's nature is so, it is beyond ours. And, we're talking about very often picture language when it comes to the ways in which God deals with human beings. But for him, I mean, he obviously, his big thing is always putting things in the context of the biblical picture of Israel and the Messiah and Jesus. And for him, I think he especially when it comes to the passages in the New Testament that have been sort of leapt upon as sort of the Calvinist interpretations, he would say what you're looking at there really is people like Paul talking about the story of Israel more than your personal salvation, when it comes to some of those passages that have sometimes been used as proof texts for, predestination and so on. So I think that he would have something to say along those lines, where he thinks passages are potentially being misconstrued to kind of fit a particular, predestination type of theology.
Do you come across any other resources on a particular subject in your work? I know that you've mentioned you don't talk about this particular topic with Calvinism, but the concepts of determinism, especially when talking to atheists, could be helpful. Any other resources that our listening audience may want to be aware of? I know they can search on the Unbelievable broadcast and see many discussions you've had with, you've already mentioned Dr. Wright, William Lane Craig on the other side, Helm, I think, has been on your program as well from the Calvinistic side.
Yep.
And myself and Chris Date talked about this topic. Are there other resources possibly that you've come across?
Well, there's certainly other Unbelievable shows where we've covered these issues. In fact, specifically a debate on Molinism and Calvinism was very popular just at the end of last year between William Lane Craig and James White, that we hosted. And likewise, if you search through the archives, you'd find different iterations of different kinds of discussions on these issues. I found Braxton Hunter's conversation with was it Dan
Barker?
Dan Barker. Yeah, that was very good back in 2020. If you want a kind of a good to and fro on the kind of issues around, atheists who, believe in material determinism and so on. We did a good one. We've just been talking about the question of reason and whether determinism undercuts that. We had a great discussion between another popular atheist YouTuber called Cosmic Skeptic, or Alex O'Connor is his real name, and he was in conversation with Oxford philosopher Max Baker Hitch, and they had a very good interaction on whether determinism is fatal for reason. So you could look that one up as well on the Unbelievable channel. The reality is, I don't find many people really writing popular level books on this, perhaps because it is just one of those slightly more niche issues in the eyes of many people. You might find chapters within books, where it gets dealt with, but and you've got people who are kind of taking it in interesting directions. So, for instance, that issue around material, the consequences of a deterministic view on an atheist view. People have taken what C.S. Lewis did in the argument from reason, and then you've had people like Alvin Plantinga and others kind of then extend that to why a kind of purely naturalistic view of the universe is a problem for believing in evolution, or believing in that we are, that our thinking minds are a product of a non-rational process and so on. So it's been developed in interesting ways by scholars like that. Though I, off the top of my head, I'd struggle to kind of give you a really sort of, the people who are writing at a really accessible, user-friendly level on these issues, because I don't think there are that many of them at the moment. So that's probably some work to be done on that front.
Well, I'd say there's definitely a lot on the Calvinistic side. There seems to be a book every day released on the side of defending Calvinism, but very rarely do you see books like John Lennox's book that are coming out specifically on that topic or to address that particular issue. But I did want to be respectful of your time, Justin, and appreciate so much your willingness to come on. But I want to remind our readers, our listeners, and those who read of our blog as well, but a little bit about what you're doing. I know you started the program, but some people tune in during the middle of it, and I want them to make sure to know what's coming up with Premier Christian Radio. So let us know a little bit more about how we can get involved.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Well, I've mentioned a couple of things that we're doing. The Big Conversation is a new season of shows coming up where we bring some of the biggest minds across the Christian and atheist spectrum together. We've got some exciting people that we're going to be having. I won't tell you who exactly, but if you go to thebigconversation.show, we will be revealing with a promo soon who's coming up for this next season of The Big Conversation. But the main thing, just right on our horizon as we speak, is our Unbelievable conference taking place in London at the British Library. You can come in person if you're in the area, but you can attend from anywhere at all in the world online, hopefully at a time that's good for you, because we're doing it at 9 a.m. Eastern in the US. And we've got some wonderful speakers: Alistair McGrath, Glenn Scrivener, Sharon Dirks. We've got international people who are coming over: Joseph D'Souza, who's a bishop in the church in India. We've got Lisa Fields, who's an African-American apologist. We've got some really interesting characters, because we're going to be doing really, we're going to be opening up the whole question of how we speak with grace and truth into a confused and divided world. There are so many issues that both in the culture and in the church seem to be dividing people. How do we have a confident voice in light of all those issues? How do we speak the truth of Jesus with the grace of Jesus? That's what we're going to be doing at this year's conference, and anyone is welcome to come along and join us. The online tickets, there's kind of a premium price where you get lots of stuff thrown in, like access to the digital download afterwards, free ebook and more. But you can actually pay what you want if you just want to turn up. You know, you could come for free if you wanted. So it's unbelievable.live is the place to go and get yourself booked in.
Well, I'll be sure to include those links in the show notes for those that are interested, as well as the link for your book and your broadcast, and encourage people to tune in if you have not already to Unbelievable, because I do believe that Christianity is very much believable. It is reasonable, and I think Justin has done a great job on his program to help demonstrate that, bringing on some of the best of the best scholars from the Christian faith to bring a defense for the faith, and like you said, to speak truth with love, to use grace. How much more so should we speak with grace when we're having an intramural discussion among Christians about this topic? And Justin has done that so well in speaking to the lost world. How much more so should we as Christians, when having these discussions with other Christians that disagree with us, be able to show grace and love towards one another? So thank you for modeling that, Justin. Thank you for the work that you do, and thank you again for coming on the program.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Leighton. I hope to bring you back on one of our shows in the future as well.
I would love to, anytime. God bless you, my friend.
God bless you.